I want to talk about the 10 Commandments today. I want to talk about this law that was just passed in Louisiana that is forcing the 10 Commandments to be on display in large readable letters from every vantage point in the classroom, from the kindergarten classroom all the way to the college classroom. And I know I don't typically get too political on this channel. I have political views. I, of course, see the overlap between religion and politics, unfortunately, but I find it doesn't typically serve the mission of the channel best. But every once in a while, I think it is important to get in on a current issue and just say my part on it. And I know everyone is talking about this right now. So if you're here, I appreciate you hearing it from me. I'll do my best to respect your time. In fact, I've put together an agenda so we can be hyper efficient, and we're going to look at this from a few different angles. So for the agenda, the first thing we're going to do is talk about what is this? I'm going to lay out the law itself, what it consists of, and what it mandates. Then second, we're going to talk about how or why this is happening. Then for the third one, we're going to talk about the opposition and the legal battles that are coming for it. 4, I want to talk about the implications of this. 5, I want to talk more about the separation between church and state. And then for the last 2, we're going to take a bit of a side journey. We're going to first look at the 10 Commandments biblically. Let's talk about those commandments. Maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe it's something that should be hung up. Or maybe most of these commandments have a secret dark side that the average Christian isn't thinking of. We'll talk about that. And then the last thing I want to cover are the other laws, especially the laws that predate the 10 Commandments. After all, the governor said this.
If you want to respect the rule of law, you got to start from the original lawgiver, which was Moses.
Is that so? The original lawgiver, Moses. And the woman to his right actually corrects him right after that and says, given by God. And he says, oh yes, so that we could all have them, which is not correct in any sense. And so let's look at the actual original lawgivers, because the Israelite society had definitely been influenced from a few societies that came before it. So why just stop right here at the particular religion you like, even though it's Judaism that they're really promoting here, which is another issue we'll talk about. Why not just put up the sayings of Jesus? But why draw this arbitrary line in the sand? If you want to go back to the originals, you can't just erase the rest of history as we know it. So I'm going to give you some of those examples. But point 1, what is this law? The law is called House Bill 71, or you'll hear it referred to as HB 71. It was just signed in a couple days ago to effect by the Governor Jeff Landry. And the specifics are this. The 10 Commandments must be displayed on a poster or within a frame. The minimum dimensions need to be 11 by 14. The text must be neutral and easy to read, and it also must be the central theme of the document. And specifically when talking about the font, it needed to be large and clear enough that it could be seen from any position in the room. So the minimum is 11 by 14, but you think about a college classroom, a lecture hall, and I imagine we're going to have to be seeing some incredibly huge, if not completely overwhelming sizes of these 10 Commandments. Now, they also specified, which is hilarious that they had to, which version of the 10 Commandments it is to be printed. There are different iterations, not only between the Catholics and the Jews and the Christians, but even within the Christian denomination, because you have differences of how they're even put together in the Bible. Depending what argument you want to make, you can say there's definitely 2, potentially 3 versions of the 10 Commandments. But the one that is going into effect is the one that is most common with evangelical white Protestants. I'm putting them up on the screen so you can just see which 10 we're talking about. Again, for the scope of application, it is every single classroom from kindergarten to college. If the classroom is receiving state funds, it is mandatory that they have this displayed. So these schools are required to do it for every single classroom, and it is on the staff, the administration of the school, to be responsible for ensuring that they do indeed go up and that they are maintained, as well as all the specific compliances. The framing of this law is interesting because other states have tried to do this and have failed or have had to compromise, and we'll get to that. But the way that Louisiana is going about this is we're trying to honor the history of this particular state, which just so happens to be a law that is based off of the 10 Commandments. So it's just here to A, give a history lesson, and B, promote moral behavior. We want to make sure the kids aren't bullying each other. We want them to know what's right and wrong. And don't get me wrong, I think it's great to say that we should uphold some kind of moral value, that there should be some kind of ethics everyone is held to when they attend these schools. Surely there is a secular way to do this, or maybe we even need to look at some of the root sources and address those, like poverty levels, income, how many students are hungry when they go to school. That might actually move the needle a lot more. Louisiana's educational program is already rocky. It is 49th out of 50 here in the US. Maybe we should be focused on that. Maybe we should look at some of the root causes that go along with that instead of acting like putting up 10 random commandments, 4 of which don't have anything to do with actual behavior, and a couple of those even that are thought crime, and focus on the realities. Again, it's not just an education problem in Louisiana. In 2022, Louisiana had the highest murder rate in the nation. It is one of the most violent crime states in the nation. 1/5 of people in Louisiana live below the poverty line. Having text in a classroom that says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," won't solve that. Louisiana is already a very Christian state within the country. Where are all the Christian values? Why aren't they kicking in? Why is there so much poverty? Why is there so much murder and violent crime? Why are there so many teen pregnancies? Why is the education so terrible? This just goes back to my video on the data about Christians not really being new creations, and to act like this is in any way for the children, which is also how it's being framed, is ridiculous. So the framing is important here because even though they've been vocal about the fact that we're a Christian nation, we're founded on Christian values, and we should be able to have this Christian document, the way they're approaching it is about just a general sense of morals, something to point at, and this happens to be the most historically, culturally significant thing we want to teach our students about where they come from. This will allow for the Supreme Court, when it inevitably, and it has already been sued against by 4 different groups, and we'll get into that, this will allow for the Supreme Court to not have to consider as strongly, or that's the idea, some of the religious implications, the separation of church and state, etc. So a little bit smarter than some of the previous attempts, but still ridiculous. Let's move on to point 2, the how and the why of this. The first thing, and it's pretty obvious, I think if you're from the States, is to understand the political climate in Louisiana. It is extremely conservative and evangelical. There is significant influence from these religious groups. The political landscape has not been quiet on their desire to shape the state to return to more traditional Christian values. Again, what a weird line in the sand to draw, because most of human history, going back to the correct Christian values, is going to be killing people for how they think. If you think that that sounds extreme, stick around for, I think, point 6, where we go through the law and the penalty for all these laws that were just as necessary as the law itself. But that's not what's written down on the tablet, but that is the baggage that is inherently attached to these things. And again, for a group of Christians that so often has to, for their own sake of belief, dismiss the Old Testament, to pull something straight from the Torah, completely out of context, out of place, and say that this represents Christian values is insane. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Unfortunately, there has been this growing trend amongst lawmakers, kind of the death throes of, we think we're going to lose political power at some point, so we can A, appease all of the Christians in our territories, and B, this is kind of our last stab to create this Christian nationalism. And within this, you had 2 key proponents when it comes to what's happening in Louisiana. You have Rep. Dodie Horton, who is the primary author of HB 71 and has been very vocal in advocating for religious concepts to be brought about in a legal way. Again, she has argued it from a moral point of view. This is what's going to give our students the moral guidance that they need, which, come on, this is just so obviously not a good list. Even the parts that are good are not good, and there's better out there. We're just acting like this is the height of genius when it comes to ethics or morality. It's so ordinary, and it's missing so much. Well, Brandon, you have to have a short list at some point. Agreed. There's 613 actual commandments from the Lord, and each and every one of them is of the same import when it comes to sin or no sin. You break one, you're guilty of them all, Paul says. And you know what the other 603 don't do? They don't help. They don't make this better. They don't fill in the nuance that needs to be there to differentiate between killing and murder, between major theft and petty survival theft, that explain how to properly regulate the thought crime of coveting. I think you could almost give any educated adult 10 minutes and say, come up with 10 better commandments, if we can only have 10, that we want to instill to our future generation. And if true, I think just proves how ridiculous it is that we're acting like this is some God-given set of rules. But off track already again, the other main proponent is, of course, the Governor Jeff Landry. He eagerly signed the bill. He's been incredibly vocal about this. He says that this kind of thing in schools is essential for nurturing good citizenship and moral behavior. How lacking. Even worse, as he anticipates the legal troubles, he is calling this a fight for religious freedom. This is a fight against religious freedom, a fight for one particular version of one particular religion to get one additional freedom that's already unconstitutional is the opposite of a fight for religious freedom. You are quashing everyone else's religion and right to not be religious when you do this. If you want to say you believe yours is the right one and you're going to fight to take this over as a Christian national state, at least you'd be honest. But acting like this is in the name of religious freedom has got to be the most hypocritical statement that there is. And of course, it's straight from the governor that signed it in. But let's move on to point 3, which is going to be the opposition and understanding some of the legalities here. So again, there has been a few of these laws that tried to bring this kind of thing about in the past. We can talk about Stone versus Graham. This is probably the first one you're going to hear about. When Kentucky tried to do the same thing Louisiana is doing now, and the Supreme Court shut it down as unconstitutional. The court at that time held that it was breaking specifically the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment because it had a clear religious purpose, thereby endorsing a particular religious view. And that's why the way that Louisiana doing it right now, making it historically and culturally significant, is what I think they're trying to avoid. Oh, it's not clearly that this is to endorse a particular religion. It just so happens to be that this is, I guess, religious if you want to call it that, but we did base our country off it. We did base the laws that governed Louisiana off it. So, we're just showing homage. We're just teaching correct tradition and history to our students. And with the Supreme Court we have right now, that very well may be a good enough argument. In 2001, there was an incident in Alabama that posted a big monument of the 10 Commandments in their state house and was then overturned and removed by federal order for, again, citing the same things, this Establishment Clause, the separation of church and state. Now, the Supreme Court has not always historically gone in the same direction. In 2005 in Texas, they actually granted a 10 Commandments monument on state capitol grounds because it was part of a larger historical display, and thus the context was different. They didn't find it to be breaking or damaging the interpretation of the Establishment Clause. So again, we can see Louisiana understand what has worked and hasn't worked and is going down a similar line. And I'll give you one more historical understanding into this, and it comes from 1971. We got something that was established as the Lemon Test to see if something is indeed breaking that Establishment Clause. The test considers whether the law has a secular purpose, whether its principal effect inhibits or helps a particular religious cause, and whether it fosters an excessive government entanglement, I think was the word used, with religion. So many people think HB 71 will fail this particular test that was established back in 1971. But again, I think that the way they're trying to go about it and who's on court now might not work out that way. So who are the main groups that are now suing Louisiana and under what pretense? Well, first you have the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It's in the name, freedom from religion. The children who have to go to these schools do not have a freedom from these religious oversights and commands. There's the AU, which is Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and then you have the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, that is suing. And I'm going to read you an article really quick from them. Not the whole article, just part of their phrasing. The displays mandated by HB 71 will result in unconstitutional religious coercion of students who are legally required to attend school and are thus a captive audience for school-sponsored religious messages. They will also be sending a chilling message to students and families who do not follow the state's preferred version of the 10 Commandments that they do not belong. They are not welcome in our public schools. We are preparing a lawsuit to challenge HB 71. The law violates the separation of church and state and is blatantly unconstitutional. The First Amendment promises that we will get to decide for ourselves what religious beliefs, if any, to hold to and practice without pressure from the government. Politicians have no business imposing their preferred religious religious doctrine on students and families in public schools. And again, there are similar statements from the AU and the FFRF. So with all three of these organizations promising to file lawsuits against this bill, the bill still continues. And this is also different because we have seen the threat of lawsuit already be enough in many of these other cases to get the other party to back down. That is not happening. If anything, it becomes a call to action in this case for the Christians of the area to stand up against the evil oppressors who want to take away their religious freedom. The irony, the hypocrisy, it's absolutely mind-boggling. But let's move on to, we've talked about a little point 4 here, the implications of such a law passing. One, I think the first implication is on the schools themselves. The fact that they are now these public school teachers and administration, many of which who will be Christian, but not all agree, and many of which who follow another religious practice or no religious practice at all, are now put in a very strange ethical dilemma where they have to abide by what will become law or risk their careers, their livelihoods. That's no small thing. Even the distraction that this is taking away from the students and the staff members at the schools. Think about all of the one-on-one conversations, if and when this goes into effect, where these students who are saying, this doesn't represent me or what I believe. We're talking about ages from kindergarten to college. How many teachers are going to have time, I don't want to say wasted because it's a real issue, but it wouldn't be an issue if this law didn't go into effect. How many students and teachers are going to have time dedicated to this issue instead of catching up from spot 49 in the educational program? How much personal time and money is going to be wasted from families that feel the need to fight this legally as well? These kinds of fights simply suck up the time, money, energy, and resources from where they should otherwise be going. And of course, I think I mentioned with the students themselves, just the psychological impacts and the distraction from education. Even more scary, though, I think, is the long-term impact, the legal precedent that this is going to set. How many states will follow? In fact, the very outcome of this legal claim could result in a new interpretation of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. That's really scary. People can act like this is some one-off issue and it's just one state that's already pretty Christian wanting to do one pretty Christian thing. Maybe we give it to them. I couldn't disagree more. This is a wild change in what we have considered to be constitutional, and if allowed, it's a tone change. It's truly a first step towards a Christian nationalist country. It will normalize all religious displays. So even if you think, the 10 Commandments aren't that bad, do you agree with everything in the Bible to that degree? Do you maybe want to go read your Bible first and be a little more careful of the culture that you're actually letting in? And by the way, I'm very aware that many Christians don't see this as a win, but many, many Christians do. And I'm majoring in the majors here. If you're a Christian who can see why this is not okay, I appreciate your open-mindedness and your nuance and your understanding and your logic. But if you're also like, if it had to be one, I'm glad it's my religion, you've already lost it. You should be fighting as hard against this as if Sharia law was trying to be established in our public schools. If the idea is that anyone in the majority gets to have their religion be the exception to the rule, we're going to be in trouble, including Christians. The impact on religious minorities is obvious. This is going to lead to educational inconsistencies, as I'm sure county by county, spot by spot, school by school, there's going to be differences in the number of self-proclaimed Christians and those that are evangelical and that agree with this versus those that do not. And schools where everyone just accepts it because they're higher in this might be able to move on faster, getting back to normal education, where schools that are fighting it and having a lot of issues in the classroom because of it will lead to educational inequality for those particular schools or students, which can also just include increased polarization. That's the last thing we need, to be splitting these differences so drastically down the middle in such a public way, creating sides, in groups and out groups. And the solutions to me are so obvious. There are certain things that just shouldn't exist in the public schooling system. And by the way, there's also things from the left that I think are pushed in public schooling that I don't necessarily agree with either. I'm being consistent. I want education to be about education and not political, cultural, religious, or ideological philosophies. So you either have to include everything or you have to not include everything. There's really no in between. If they said, you know what, we've done our research and the best that we can tell, here's the first 10 sets of laws. It doesn't matter what nation they come from. It doesn't matter what religion was attached to them. We just think it's cool to look at the history of law. We consider ourselves a moral country, and we realize that this country comes after many before it, many nations, many cultures, many forms of ethics, and we want to recognize the beginning of ethics. So we're proposing in every school, maybe in just one spot, not in every classroom, that would be crazy, a ode to the history of law, and we can show you an evolution of this law. Cool. That sounds really educational, and it also sounds like a way to still promote morality and the need for a governing body. The very fact that it is not that so obviously shows what a push it is for Christian control. And all of this kind of brings me into point 5, which is I want to talk about the benefits of a separation between church and state, that everyone should want this. I want everyone's freedoms protected. That's what I really want. I don't want to strip away ever by force or law someone's right to believe what they believe. I am not a militant atheist. I do think Christianity is incorrect and harmful, and I have no problem talking about those inconsistencies and those harms. But at the end of the day, I would just as equally fight for you to believe in it as I would for my right not to have to. And even as a Christian, this was one of the first things as I started leaving fundamentalism that I could understand. You know, at that point, I still didn't agree with gay marriage because it was a sin. But I started to think, wait a second, despite my religious belief, do I have a right to push this legally through the state onto other people? And as embarrassing as it is to say that I was ever once having to consider that, shows you the indoctrination that I was under. But reaching those conclusions, even while still maintaining my faith, was an eye-opener. And it was as simple as self-preservation. What if someday more secular people are in power, or more Islamic people are in power, or some other new religion or cult crops up and takes over? Would I want them to be able to tell me I can't be married to my wife? I can't receive legal benefit that comes along with that? Would I want them to dictate what my children learn in school? And so from a place of, again, self-preservation and philosophical consistency, even as a believer, I could get on board with the importance of this separation between church and state. Let's look at the importance to truly worship freely despite whatever you believe. I don't think the majority of Christians who act politically, at least, believe that. I think they believe my God, my way, my rule, my law, my ethic, my morality is the only one and thus the one that should be enforced by law because it's right. So the nation be damned. And that's terrifying. We already have enough conflict within the denominations. What happens when you get a state-sponsored particular form of denominational acceptance? Go ask Northern Ireland how that went between the Protestants and the Catholics. I think one of the other benefits that if you're a Christian who hasn't gone quite all the way into Christian nationalism, you should understand that what has kept much of Christianity at bay from overreaching is this melting pot of what it means to be Christian. And my denomination says this, but there's still equal, well, not respect, but equal grounding, maybe. Again, the state hasn't chosen sides. So there's this relative peace amongst the denominations. Well, once the state starts choosing a side, I believe much of that peace will go away and things are going to look a lot more dramatic than they do now. We need equal separation between church and state, not only to protect the religious, but of course to protect the non-religious. We need to ensure that non-Christians, which are non-religious and those of other religions, are not discriminated against by state policies that favor a particular religion. Do you hear how scary that is? If it hasn't sunk into you yet, replace Christianity with Islam, and I bet you're terrified. You do not want to give over this control. You do not want the state to think it's a good thing to have majority religious control be the governing authority. So don't take advantage of it right now, just because you're a Christian and it happens to be from a Christian lens, supposedly. I have a few acts pulled up that I wanted to share with you really quickly. We've had the Establishment Clause used to strike down laws that would impose religious practices on non-believers, such as mandatory prayer in public schools. In 1963, we prohibited mandatory Bible readings in public schools, safeguarding the rights of non-Christian students. Even going back to 1943, the Supreme Court ruled that students cannot be forced to salute the flag or recite the Pledge of Allegiance. That was protecting Jehovah's Witnesses' religious beliefs against idolatry. This is what I mean, even the importance of religious neutrality so that we don't isolate these other sides. People should feel okay believing what they believe in and not being forced to do something against their belief. Again, from a state perspective. We got the Equal Access Act in 1984 that ensures that non-curricular student groups, including religious religious groups have the same access to public school facilities as other groups. We got the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 93, a law that protects individual religious practice from government interference, provided it does not impose an undue burden on others. So we can end this section with three main goals of separation between church and state. The first one is to prevent a theocracy. If you hate America's current system and you think it's so corrupt and you think it's so terrible, and trust me, I have a lot of things I would critique about it too. I would take it any day. I would take a worse version of it than an actual theocracy. If you think a theocracy is better, you are A, ignorant of history, or B, you know the history of what can happen, and you don't care because you personally will benefit under this particular kind of theocracy. 2, it encourages pluralism. A secular state encourages and promotes, just organically as a byproduct, a pluralistic society where we accept and respect other people and their differences. Again, it doesn't mean there's never bigotry. It doesn't mean that no one ever infringes on those rights. But having something on the books to generally try to protect it is much better than not. Much better than putting something specifically on the books that only protects one kind of religion's version of that religion over every single other. And 3rd would be to promote rational public policy in general. Policies are more likely to be inclusive and evidence-based if they are not religious. That could be its own episode, and we can definitely give more examples there. But let's continue to move on to point 6, where we're going to do a quick biblical analysis on the 10 Commandments. What I really want to look at here is, okay, fine, you really believe that this is the right thing to do. We should have the 10 Commandments in schools because regardless of what one personally believes religiously, it's so abundantly clear that we are better off having a reminder of these 10 perfect points of ethic. And thus, we should all be able to come around this and not fight it, even if we don't agree with Christianity or Judaism to begin with. And if these 10 laws were really that unique and perfect, I would say, fine. I would also say you can just write them on the whiteboard. The fact you're trying to give them weight by attaching them to an invisible being that we can't prove is part of the religious issue with it. And it's also why many students won't accept it. Why don't we teach why these 10 things, once we create a better list of 10, are actually beneficial and useful to the individual, to the group, to the society at large. And thus we want to try to promote it early and often. That would be fine, especially if they also reflected the actual law at the time. Many of these 10 commandments are not enforceable by law. So acting like we're helping out the community, that we're teaching people how to live within this community better and properly from an earlier educational standpoint is simply false. 1, you shall have no other gods before me. Tell me, what is this to do for a student in Louisiana? The context of this is that the people of Israel at this time were a polytheistic group, and this jealous God wanted to rein them into monotheism. So whether it was this God or the men speaking on behalf of this God and using it to control the population, it was a change for one group of people at one time to go from polytheistic to monotheistic. So this perfect list of 10 that is so important, we have to get it in front of these young souls to save them early. How does number 1 help? Except to further your traditional belief in this particular God concept. What it really does, by the way, is just creates the ground, the foundation for judging others as incorrect for what they believe, which is the opposite again of religious freedom. So please stop saying this is a religious fight for freedom. The second commandment is you shall not make for yourself a graven image. We had a real problem with idol worship back in the day. Physical, literal idol worship. Not spending too much time on your phone or caring too much about your kids. You know, all the things the modern day Christian has said is an idol, anything that gets in between you and your God. But again, what is the average Louisiana school child to do with this? If taken literally, it stifles artistic creation. Is that what we want for our students? Or we just kind of don't care because it happens to be included and it is about the God we believe in, so we'll just say it even though we don't understand it. And that's another thing. The denominations cannot agree on what this actually means, what counts, what doesn't count. Is it okay to have pictures of Jesus? Is it okay to have stained glass windows or murals? What happens when you abuse this and you say it's really about idol worship in the more metaphorical sense? Now, do you have a more given right to create laws around anything you deem is ungodly. Yeah, that's not terrifying at all. And everybody knows this. The first 4 of these commandments have to do just with God's jealousy, essentially, and nothing else. Again, wasting so much precious space, 40%, when we can only give 10. The third one is God protecting his own name. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain. Well, that's at direct odds with freedom of speech. In these same public classrooms, are they not going to be taught the freedom of speech and yet see no conflict in the third of the 10 important commandments that is in every single room that they attend throughout their entire education says you can't say this particular word in this particular way? No one sees a conflict with that. And furthermore, I literally don't know, and this is a humble brag, not that it matters now, I am the only person I know that never said, "Oh my God," which, by the way, is the modern Christian evangelical interpretation of this commandment, is swearing in God's name. There are other interpretations. I didn't do it. I had so much reverence and fear of my God. I did not do it. I'm not saying I was perfect. I'm not saying I didn't have any sin, but I'm literally the only Christian I know that I never heard say this. The amount of Christians I heard say, "God damn it," blew my mind. So again, not only is this terrifying in terms of controlled speech, but it is also something Christians themselves don't even care about on the vast majority. 4 is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Something else Christians don't do. And if you're a Christian that just so happens not to work on Sunday, what if you were asked to work on Sunday but not Monday? Would you quit your job? Is Sunday even the right Sabbath day? Is it not actually Saturday? If so, the same thing applies. Do we really put either day aside to completely spend the day resting and worshiping? On average, most Christians watch more sports on their Sabbath day, whichever one it happens to be, than they do spend time in church or worship. But no, go ahead. This should definitely take up 10% of the laws we want to fill as the best morals for the next generation. But number 5 is a good one. Honor your mother and your father. Oh, great. We need to get back to that. Those traditional values of respecting authority. What about when authority shouldn't be respected? What about when mom and dad are drunks or physically abusive or sexually abusive or verbally abusive, or they don't take care of you, they don't feed you or clothe you properly? Are we supposed to keep quiet, honor our mother and our father, make sure that no repercussion is taken on them at our expense? Because that can and has been abused hugely, especially within religious communities where these things get covered up. By the way, the rest of that verse is disgusting. So that you may live a long life. And we know that that is because parents had a right in this same society that wrote this same law to stone their children to death. That is also a law on the books. That is the repercussion for a wayward or disobedient child. Kind of takes all the fun out of that nice little commandment when it's because otherwise your parents will kill you. Say the whole thing out loud. Honor your mother and your father, otherwise your father will take you into the street with a group of other random people and they will stone you to death with glee. Write that on the tablet and then let's try to pass it. 6, you shall not murder. Congratulations, Old Testament law. You now hit the exact same mark that every single set of laws has ever had, that there is a kind of killing which is considered unlawful. We call that murder, and we don't want it. It is the first basis of self-preservation. If I don't want to be killed, then I'm going to have to be in a society where I agree not to kill others. That affords me a certain peace of mind and privilege, and I just have to follow that back. It is evolutionary. It is not special. Them getting this one right means nothing. Furthermore, as societies advance, and I understand that we can't put this back on them now, but to act like we haven't improved upon it, can we please distinguish some of those levels of murder? Can we talk about the difference between self-defense? Should we consider the nuance of an accident or premeditated murder? All the different things we now even have in this society that is supposedly based off this very simple Judeo-Christian number 6 commandment of do not murder. Do not murder didn't mean very much. One of the next things that happens is God commanding Joshua to go commit genocide, where women and children would be killed. It's not murder because God commanded it, which all boils down to this divine command theory. If killing can't be murder because the right authority was in place, do you not see the parallels for why it should be scary that the right authority who is putting this in such a prominent place can be the ones that dictate what is considered murder and isn't? Number 7, you shall not commit adultery. That's a great one. It shouldn't be by law, though. How many Christians would be locked up or get the death penalty if this was treated in the same way as it was in the society in which it came from. If you don't like the rest of what's associated with these commands, we shouldn't be repping them. If you're not a Christian that will go vote tomorrow for an affair to be a legal crime with a legal penalty, I'm not talking about who gets what in the divorce. I'm talking about you had an affair and thus you're going to jail, or we put you to death, which, by the way, historically really only affected the females. If you're not willing to follow that all the way through, stop acting like it's so impressive to be on the tablets. And again, not that I agree with adultery, but it should not be in the top 10 anyways. 8, another good one, you shall not steal. Again, can we get some nuance on the differences in stealing? But sure, just like murder, this is something people wanted to be able to have a right to their property. You don't take my stuff, that means we probably need a society where we govern that I can't take yours also. But I'll give it to it. Number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. This really came about because of the importance of, in a culture with a very limited sense of being able to investigate. They didn't have DNA, they didn't have video evidence, they didn't have anything like this. It was testimonial, and we needed to take that seriously, and this law reflects that. Again, really no quarrels with it, just that it's outdated, and we can do better, and we have added additional nuance to it, and our penalty for it is also not as extreme. And number 10, our thought crime friend, you shall not covet. In terms of a moral lesson, teaching kids to be content with what they have, to find a way to love what it is they have currently instead of seeking out for more when it won't be ultimately as fulfilling, which we can look at even through scientific study and data. I'm generally fine as a principle encouraging children to find contentment or find value in less materialistic things. Great. I'm also fine with someone disagreeing with me on that, by the way. I also think that that's easy to say from a position of privilege. When you don't have what you need, it's not coveting, it's survival. And when you do have what you need, it's not inherently wrong to see that the grass is greener. If you act off of that in a way where you go steal from your neighbor because of it, sure, we can talk about the legal ramifications. But controlling it at the thought level is insane. First of all, it's completely impractical unless you have an all-knowing God who will strike you dead for having the wrong thoughts. But again, if the frame, and this is what I would love to do, and I'm sure the lawyers will do, is if the frame is that this is about preserving two things: the historical cultural significance of where we got our modern values from, which we can prove is not entirely the case, or at least that it's an arbitrary line they've drawn, and 2, that we want to help our students become better people and live more moral lives so we can get more people out of poverty. We can get people with higher education rates. We can cut down on teen pregnancies. Then I can also argue, choose a better set of 10. Trust me, plenty exist before and during this same time frame. And we're going to get into that next. That's going to be what we close out on. But yeah, I'd love to argue from that second side of we can do better. How about one law in our top 10 that says don't own another person as property? How about one that says don't hurt children in any way? They're the most vulnerable among us, and they should be always, no matter what, fed, sheltered, protected physically, emotionally, and sexually. Is that too hard? Can you imagine the world of difference that could make if that was something that was actually considered, written down, and an ethic and moral that we actually lived out? Instead, as you saw in my data video, Christians are the number 1 herder of children. 93% of sexual abusers identified as Christian. You want to protect the children in these classrooms? You make sure that one of the commandments you're going to enforce by law is in every single one of their rooms is that they have a right not to be hurt. So our last point that we're going to end on is just looking at some comparative law from ancient time. And just like I did with my video on fancy fiction from Sunday, I want to point out that law was also not special within the Bible. It got some things right, most of which were already established, and it got some things wrong that had also been established incorrectly. And we've had to make improvements since. And by the way, some of the things they got right before the Bible. So when were the 10 commandments put down? Well, you're going to get different answers even from Christians. We're looking somewhere around the 13th century BCE for when the story of Sinai would have taken place if it did indeed happen at all. But we're looking for the amalgamation, the editing, the redaction, the putting together of most of what we have of the Old Testament during the 6th century BCE, during the Babylonian exile. So was there an oral tradition that existed before that? Yes, probably, most definitely. What century should we give that to exactly? I don't know. But again, getting it down in writing, probably 6th century. We can debate all of that, and and I talk about it a lot in my secular Bible study series, so feel free to go and check that out. But with that understood, let's look at some of these other forms of law. How about the Code of Ur-Nammu? This is 2100 to 2050 BCE, so it predates. This is ancient Sumer, specifically the city of Ur. Funny enough, this is where Abraham is from. It's the oldest known law code created by King Ur-Nammu. It includes laws about theft, property damage, and personal injury. And also the great one, don't murder. It predates the Bible. It probably had its own influence in leading to other cultures of the time that eventually the Israelites would have borrowed from when creating their code specific to their people. And even, by the way, if this somehow independently cropped up amongst all of these different cultures, and there wasn't this sharing or borrowing that we can probably guesstimate towards, so what? Again, it's ordinary. It's not special. Yahweh, the God of the Israelite people, had no further moral knowledge than anyone else of the day. Morals evolved and have gotten better. If the modern day Christian today has a child that is raped by a stranger or even a neighbor, you know what they don't want? They don't want to have to sell that daughter to that neighbor or stranger, which is the penalty for rape in the Bible. So not only is don't rape not one of the 10 commandments, but where it does address it, it addresses it as a property crime. You devalued a man's property, the virginity of his daughter. So you need to take her since no other man will want her because you broke her, you used her, and you need to recuperate what the father will have lost for the sale of that daughter. That's your amazing moral code that you want represented by the 10 best ones. This entire video could have been that statement. But what about the laws of Ishuna? This is 1930 BCE, the city of Ishuna, Mesopotamia. These laws covered a ton of daily life. You had laws within marriage, property rights, trade, commerce. I mean, pretty inclusive, much earlier for sure than the biblical laws. The Code of Lipit Ishtar, 1934 to 1924 BCE, the Sumerian king Lipit Ishtar of Isin. Again, the code deals with family, property rights, and social order even. For all intents and purposes, more evolved and advanced than what we see from the Law of Moses. The big one is the Code of Hammurabi, 1754 BCE, so still before the Israelite law. Babylonian origin under King Hammurabi. It contains 282 laws addressing criminal justice, agriculture, family matters, and civil rights. Now, I'm not saying all of those laws are great, but it is the same or better than what we get with the Old Commandment laws. An eye for an eye is straight from Hammurabi, and we see it exactly copied into the mitzvot. The Hittite laws of the 1650 to 1500 timeframe BCE. This is from the Hittite Empire in Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. These laws addressed issues with family life and agriculture and trade. And also, this might sound familiar. Here's an example law. If anyone kills a male or female slave, he shall pay 4 shekels of silver. And yeah, it's a law of that day. You could have slaves. It's considered property. So, if property gets damaged, you have to make it right financially. The exact same kind of thing we see in the Bible. That, by the way, if you were an average day Christian citizen in the United States, you would even see problems with this law while turning a cognitive dissonance blind eye to the fact that this is the kind of stuff written in your own Bible. Also around this same time in the Hittite Empire, we have the Code of Nesselim. Similar to the Hittite laws, it just focuses on the civil and criminal justice aspect. An example law even covers bestiality. Man would be put to death for having sex with a pig or a dog. More care for the sexual harm towards animals 300 years before what the earliest chance we had the Israelites could not even come up with sexual laws to protect women. We can do the Code of Urukagina from the city of Lagash, Sumer. This is 2380 to 2360 BCE, known for the social reforms, including provisions to protect the poor and reduce the power of the elite. It's often regarded as the first legal code to include any kind of social justice. So man, if we care about social justice, which even many Christians say they do, and we're trying to track back and show this, instead of putting up the 10 Commandments, shouldn't we just put up this particular code from the Sumer people? Why not? If, again, the real frame here is we just want to show the history of the culture that we've borrowed from, and we want to create good moral understanding and base for our children, this suffices. Why don't you want this in your schools? We could look at the Assyrian Empire with the Code of Ashura. This is 1075 BCE, so before the exile when the Israelite people got theirs written down, and this code includes laws related to family matters, property, and criminal justice. Really harsh laws of Assyrian law, which had, by the way, a lot of overlap, and if a woman causes the death of her husband, they shall impale curtail her. So again, we might be able to look at these kind of laws and say, hey, that's kind of weird. That's not fair. That doesn't add up. And without some biblical excuse about the perfect God who has some reason why he did this and is working through people at a time where they're restricted morally and is improving them slightly so we can get to the point of Jesus eventually and the modern ethics that we all enjoy today. And all of those excuses, we can call a spade and say, early law, pretty harsh, not understanding a lot of nuance, a little bit sexist, definitely benefiting one part of society. We can say the exact same thing for this special document you want in every single classroom in today's America. My point in showing this was hopefully clear. Many of the laws that are on the 10 Commandments are predated by them. So if we're playing the telephone game, let's go all the way back to the first caller. If this is allowed to stand, it will spread. And if this spread, more will follow. And if more follows, it really is not some big conspiratorial thing to say that we could pretty quickly get into some pretty scary hot water for a Christian national state or a future theocracy. If you're a Christian, I would ask you not to minimize this, not to take advantage of the fact that today it happens to be the religion you agree with, and stand up for the separation from a constitutional perspective that allows for the actual freedom of all religion and all thought and belief systems. I hope that this was informative and helpful to some degree. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Kitboga, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rocket, and Sean, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jared, and Christy, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Maggie, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people.